Good evening. Today is September 27th, and this is the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre, independent candidate for U.S. Senate on the LaRouche line in New York. And just for the information of viewers, this is being pre-recorded on the 26th. So if there is some major development that we have missed, that's why. But I wanted to get to what I think is the most significant development, and then we're going to talk about pre-war propaganda and censorship and targeting of anybody who would be opposed to this drive to plunge mankind over the abyss. Yesterday, President Putin had his semi-annual meeting with his Special Security Council. I want to get the name of it correct. The Security Council on Nuclear Deterrence. Now, unlike the United States, Russia and also China have written agreements. It is their policy that they do not resort to a nuclear first strike. The United States has the world in a very unstable situation because we will not issue such a declaration. And in fact, we reserve the right to launch preemptive nuclear weapons. And the reasons why we would do that are very vague. So that has contributed greatly to instability. Now, we have the situation where the British Foreign Minister Lammy and Tony Blinken, two absolute morons, in my opinion, who have no military experience whatsoever, had a meeting about 10 days ago in Kiev with Zelensky, where they, I suspect, assured him that he was going to have access to long-range missiles from the US and UK, and that they were going to secure permission for him to use those missiles to launch strikes deep into Russia. The problem with these missiles is that their targeting and guidance depends on encrypted Western systems. There is no way that the Ukrainians can operate these missiles without the direct hands-on partnership of NATO military and intelligence collaborators. This means, and Putin had said as much, that the war will have changed. It will no longer be a proxy war with Ukraine, but there will be a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Now, Blinken doesn't seem to understand what that means. The line of the British is that Putin is just bluffing. So what had to happen, according to Scott Ritter and other retired military and intelligence sources, is that Putin used the back channel to get to the Department of Defense, to get to the Pentagon. There are still people there, apparently, who do know what nuclear war means and what Putin's response means. And they got to Biden and said, under no circumstances can you allow Zelensky to launch strikes deep into Russia. So when Keir Starmer arrived and met with Biden, it was a very brief meeting. Starmer apparently was carrying with him all of the targets inside Russia that they wanted to have Ukraine strike. Biden said no. And that's why Ritter said we were 72 minutes away from a nuclear war. 2 Saturdays ago or 10 days ago, no one knew it, or very few people knew it. However, the pressure on Biden is now increasing. The European Parliament voted that they think Ukraine should be able to strike whatever it wants. Happily, the European Parliament is not a binding vote. Then the London Times, I believe it was the London Times, one of the British papers said that the British are saying, well, we'll make our own secret agreement and allow the Ukrainians to strike deep within Russia. Biden is meeting with Zelensky, I believe, today, and Zelensky is going to be going all out to pressure Biden for this permission, and who knows what's really been done behind closed doors. So for that reason, Putin gave an extremely sharp address. It's 4 minutes long, and it's translated in English. The West is supposed to follow this. I would urge people to listen carefully, because he says at least 3 times that we are changing our nuclear posture. He doesn't use that word. He says supplementing, augmenting, I mean, I don't know what it is in Russia. This is the English translation. So we're going to go to that. And if it's not audible in English, I'll tone down the Russian and just read it. So here we go.
Уважаемые коллеги, мы с вами проводим сегодня плановое мероприятие. Это совещание так и называется.
Okay. This meeting is called the regular meeting on nuclear deterrence, and it is held twice a year. On today's agenda, we will discuss the update of the fundamental principles of state policy in the area of nuclear deterrence. Alongside the military doctrine, this is a document in which Russia's nuclear strategy is officially defined and detailed. First and foremost, the basic principle of nuclear weapon use is outlawed. That the use of nuclear force is an extreme measure to protect the country's sovereignty. I want to emphasize we have always approached such matters with the utmost responsibility, fully aware of the immense power of these weapons. We have strived to strengthen the international legal framework for global stability, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and their components. Today, the nuclear triad remains the most important guarantee to ensure the security of our state and its citizens. It is a tool to maintain strategic parity and the balance of power in the world. At the same time, we see that the modern military political situation is changing dynamically, and we are obligated to take this into account, including the emergence of new sources of military threats and risks for Russia and our allies. It is important to predict the development and deployment and to adapt to the provisions of the strategic planning document to current realities. Over the past year, specialists from the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Security Council apparatus, and other agencies have conducted a deep and comprehensive analysis, evaluating the need to adjust our approaches to the potential use of nuclear forces. As a result of this work, a number of clarifications have been proposed regarding the conditions for the use of nuclear weapons. The draft of the updated principles expands the category of states and military alliances subject to nuclear deterrence. The list of military threats for which nuclear deterrence measures are taken has been supplemented. I'm stopping. Okay, we've expanded the list. The list has been supplemented. This is a change in Russia's nuclear doctrine. I would like to draw special attention to the following. The updated version of the document proposes that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state, should be considered a joint attack on the Russian Federation. Again, very important. So if Ukraine were to attack Russia, but they are being backed up by a nuclear state, i.e. the US or UK or France, that this is considered now a joint attack on the Russian Federation, not just an attack from Ukraine. Furthermore, the conditions for Russia's transition to the use of nuclear weapons are clearly defined. We will consider such a possibility as soon as reliable information is obtained about the launch of an aerospace attack and the crossing of our state borders. This includes strategic or tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonic and other airborne vehicles. We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression against Russia and Belarus. Okay? We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons against attacks against Russia and Belarus as a member of the Union state. All of these issues have been agreed upon. with the Belarusian side and the president of Belarus. This includes cases where the enemy using conventional weapons creates a critical threat to our sovereignty. Okay, so if the enemy uses conventional weapons, but it is a critical threat to the sovereignty and existence of Russia, then Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response. In conclusion, I would like to note that all the clarifications are well thought out and proportionate to the modern military threats and the risks facing the Russian Federation. Let's begin our work. Okay. So that is the situation in which the world currently exists. It is an absolute outrage that this is not on the front pages of any major news media. And it is under these circumstances that there have been not one, but two assassination attempts against former President Donald Trump, who is the Republican nominee for president and who has said on multiple occasions now that he intends to end this war through negotiation. That is a very stark contrast to Biden, who apparently is running the White House now through his wife, Jill, who is saying that that we must defeat Russia. If we keep arming Ukraine, they can beat Russia. Anyone who merely looks at a map, who knows the history of World War II, will know that this is impossible. It's not happening. Ukraine, in effect, has already lost the war. This is a charade. That's what makes it so exceedingly dangerous. So I bring up the elections because there is an enormous amount hanging on not changing policy. And we have seen in recent days an escalation in the form of censorship and also attacks or blacking out of political campaigns. In the censorship category and blackout, we have Tulsi Gabbard placed on a terrorist watch list. She is an active duty member of the National Guard. I believe she's a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard. She's not going to blow up an airplane, but she is harassed now every time she goes through an airport. We have the 20 to 30 person FBI raid on Scott Ritter's home. He is a journalist. He was writing articles that appeared in Sputnik and RT for nominal amounts of money, as he writes articles for anything else. They were saying they were investigating him for a violation of the Foreign Agent Reporting Registration Act. We have a similar raid of the home of Dmitry Simes, who was in Moscow. He was a very important advisor to Richard Nixon, an American citizen, and his home was raided without him being even informed. And besides the FBI agents who showed up, there were a whole bunch of people walking around, apparently Ukrainians, at his home. Then on the second assassination attempt of Donald Trump, we hear that this Ryan Routh character was working with the Azov battalion, was interested in making sure Ukraine won the war, was recruiting people. Who knows what other connections? He seems to have a bit of a screw loose, making him a kind of ideal candidate as the shooter in Pennsylvania. Now, at the same time as that is going on, we have a blackout of any candidate who has an alternative policy. We saw what the Democratic National Committee did to Robert Kennedy Jr. He actually really wanted to run as a Democrat. He said, that's the party of my father, my uncle. But what happened? The DNC said, we don't care if the majority of people in New Hampshire or the Iowa caucuses support you over Joe Biden. We are going to award all of the delegates to Biden. Now, at that point, what's the point of running? So you can tell everyone their vote's just going to be stolen and handed to someone else. We have what I and my guests will be discussing, all independent or minor party campaigns. Will be joined shortly by Duane Whitmer, who is now the chair of the Libertarian Party of the state of New York, has run for office in the state of New York, and I'll be joined by Robert Castle, who works with Jose Vega's campaign to discuss some of this. As all of us are aware, the state of New York tripled the signature requirement for independent or what they call minor party candidates. The Libertarian Party had already attained ballot status, as had the Green Party. They had gubernatorial candidates that got over the previous threshold, which would have allowed them to have ballot access without petitioning to nominate candidates at a convention, or if they wanted to have a primary, you could do that. And then the goalpost was moved, and the petition requirement was tripled to 45,000 signatures in a 6-week period. And although I have succeeded twice at doing this using volunteers, not any paid petitioning agencies or paid petitioners, I can say that it's virtually impossible. I never want to do it again. It is a total waste of time. It's 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, rain, snow, other hardships. It's like guerrilla warfare, and it is a really onerous task for a candidate who should be out speaking, meeting people, going to the press, and doing other things. And I can tell you now, most of the news media in the state of New York is claiming that the Senate race has only 2 candidates, Kirsten Gillibrand and this very, who is horrible creature of the swamp and military industrial complex and British Empire explicitly, which she married into British aerospace, and a character named Mike Sapricone, who's a former NYPD detective whose security firm apparently gave donations to Letitia James, and who was written up for excessive use of force multiple times and extracted a false confession from some person who ended up in jail wrongly for 21 years. So what a horrible choice. No wonder why people don't want to vote. So I will stop there, and perhaps we'll go to Duane to talk a little bit about some of the things he experienced as a candidate, which I found quite amazing, but not surprising at all, but really underscore the point. And then Robert Castle from Jose's campaign. So Duane, I'm really glad to have you here, and welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm Duane Whitmer. I'm the newly elected chair of the Libertarian Party of New York as of, last weekend. I ran for Congress in 2020 in Western New York in a district that no longer exists because New York got redistricted. And then I ran for comptroller in Erie County where I live. I live just outside of Buffalo, and I ran for Erie County executive. And every time I ran, we had more barriers to go through than the other parties. But that's kind of how it's written. It's written purposely to suppress outside thought. One thing people need to realize is that when it comes to government and running for office, most elections are already decided before you vote in November. Not the 2020 election stuff was Dominion and the fake ballots and all that. No. What really happens is right around this time of year, maybe a little bit later, right around Christmas time in this area, it depends where you are across the country, but in Western New York, right around this time of year, the political machines get together, which are the officers of the parties, the Republican and Democratic parties, the town committees. They get together and they say, okay, election season's coming in 2025. We need to find candidates that are going to most directly benefit our interests. And their interests aren't the general public, the betterment of society. Their interests are themselves. So what they do is they try to find candidates that will directly benefit their interests. They find said candidate. They say, what are you going to give us? And they endorse that candidate. Now you're going to say, well, there are primaries. There are primaries, but the machine and the jobs program are so strong that 90% of the time the endorsed candidates win the primary. This happened recently with my Congressman Nick Langworthy. He faced an outsider challenger in Carl Palladino, who ran for governor in 2010. I think Palladino spent like $2-3 million and still lost a pretty close primary, but he still lost. Langworthy was the ex GOP chair of the GOP New York State GOP chair, and he was a lame duck. The GOP is losing ground in New York State heavily under his leadership. He still won, got his promotion to Congress. That's on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, another great example of this is Buffalo Mayor Byron Brown. Byron Brown got lazy and was actually upset in the Democratic primary by upstart India Walton. And what Byron Brown did was said, hey, I lost the primary. And he was able to mount a massive, massive write-in campaign and win the race via write-in. Well, how did he do that? He went to every person he appointed to a job and said, hey, you make $150,000, $200,000 a year of taxpayer funds in this job. If I don't win, you're out. Open your pocketbooks, start knocking doors, start doing things, show up to my events, tell your friends, your family, etc. to vote, because if we lose, your gravy train ends. You're out. You have to get a real job. The massive taxpayer funded jobs program you have with the massive benefits is gone. So we got to figure something out. And then he was able to mount a massive write-in campaign. And it's, a lot of the groups that endorse the politicians are viable, for this as well. Unions, the Republican jobs program tends to be the police union, the correction officers union, the highway department unions. And then the Democratic jobs program is, the teachers union, a lot of healthcare unions. When you control those, you have a massive voting block and workforce to vote for you. And this is where both sides, they don't talk about it because they both take advantage of this. Is something like in Erie County, 20% of all residents of Erie County work for the government. They're not going to vote for smaller government. They're not going to vote for reform. They're not going to vote for change. They're not going to vote against their interests. Their jobs program, they have a good thing going. They're not going to vote to limit their power, their control, their abilities because they have a great thing going. Well, if it's 20%, if you conclude most of them are married, have kids, have family, have friends, you're approaching a pretty critical mass of the population of, in Erie County that essentially is controlled through the government jobs program. And so when we say elections are rigged, that's where it all begins right there. The endorsement, the primary, it's all like security. It's all theater. It's all theater because the endorsed candidates usually always win. And then when you say, okay, well, run as an independent candidate, which is what you're doing and I did. When I ran for Congress as an independent candidate, there were debates I wasn't invited to because I didn't qualify under this crazy rule. There was like 2.5 pages of rules. And going through it, some of them I just could not compete with. And then recently when I ran
wait, could you go through some of that? Because that really was it's unbelievable.
When I ran for county exec, they actually when I ran for Congress, it was an interesting situation. When I ran for Congress, there were fewer rules. It was like 1.5 pages. And so to little backstory on my race, I ran in the special election for NY7. I live in Western New York, and our congressman, we had a guy by the name of Christopher Christley. Our first congressman got resigned for taking inappropriate photos and sending them to people. Next congressman comes in, Chris Collins. Those of you that follow that scandal, insider trading, he gets out. New York State has the most corrupt politicians now with Eric Adams, with Cuomo. The governor before him, everyone's just doing corrupt things and resigning. So NY27 had back-to-back corrupt congressmen. There was a special election, and I actually qualified for the special election. I was going to be on the ballot. There was going to be a debate in April, and there were a couple rules that I was close on. The fundraising, I was a little short. You needed to raise $50,000. I was and there was something else I didn't qualify for, and I can't remember exactly what it was. I think I needed like a location, a physical headquarters, none of which matters when you're campaigning, but it is what it is. So there was supposed to be a special election in April. It got pushed back because of COVID till June. And so there was supposed to be a televised debate on a news station with the candidates. I didn't qualify at the time. The debate gets pushed back. I actually qualified. I hit the fundraising threshold, and because at the fundraising threshold, I was able to get a location. So I then qualified for the rules, and their response was, "Yeah, you qualify now, but you didn't back then, so we're just going to pretend you don't qualify." So I was stuck home, and getting in these debates that are publicly televised are huge for candidates like us because a lot of people don't know we exist. One thing we hear all the time is, I didn't know you were running. Well, yeah, I don't have $7 million in my war chest to send out 20 mailers a week. I don't have the jobs program to donate to me. So it's harder. So these things are, what the system does to kind of keep, voices out. And then so that's 2020, ran for Congress, learned my lesson, ran for county executive this year because I wanted to debate our current county exec on a couple things, mostly how bad Erie County is doing economically and financially, how bad it's handling COVID, and how bad it's handling the migrant crisis. I say migrant crisis because what New York is doing with their migrants is government-sponsored money laundering and human trafficking. A friend of mine and I were actually able to interview some of these migrants, and what they told us is really sad because they're human beings. And what the government's doing with the no bid contract, $500 million no bid contract at DocGo, they're putting them in these hotels with no purpose, no plan, no idea, leaving them there, feeding them stale food, telling them that if they talk to anyone, they're going to get deported, telling them if they speak out, they're going to send them back to their own country. They're treating them like prisoners. There's a lawsuit coming out of the Western New York migrant hotels where the National Guard is being called in, which the reason why the National Guard is called in is because you can't foil body cam footage. When the police respond, there's body cams and it's a foilable thing. When the National Guard is there, it's a lot harder to get information. So it's more of a secret government move. There's lawsuits coming out saying the National Guard is mistreating and in some cases raping the migrants. It's a very tragic situation. So I wanted to debate him on that and say, this is what's going on. People need to understand that, we're not helping these people. We're using them for a political stunt, and then we're leaving them to just exist. So I wanted to debate polling cars, was our county executive. I got the 1,500 signatures needed to get on the ballot. And I started to do, what I needed to do. And, there was a debate. I reached out. I said, hey, what are the rules to qualify? They have now since added another page of rules. And some of the rules they had were you needed a campaign landline, a campaign phone number. Well, my campaign is short term. I'm not going to pay Verizon $200 a month to add a phone. So I had a Google Voice number because it's free. It's easy. It's short term. They said that wasn't good enough. A Google Voice number isn't a phone number. I said, well, it's a phone number. You can call it and I'll answer. Well, it's not the same. You need a designated landline. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Another thing they said, I need to be covered in 7 news companies. Seven companies needed to cover me. I needed to have press releases covered by 7 news companies. Well, in Western New York, you have 247 Spectrum, BFO, WBEN, and the Buffalo News. There are 7 news companies, exactly 7.
So you need to be covered by every single one.
Right. And if they decide not to cover me, which they do, that's something that happened during COVID. They said, we're going to reach an agreement to not cover these outside organizations. Well, if they decide not to cover me, what do? I can't force them to cover me. So you don't cover me. It's, Channel 4, you're hosting this debate. You don't cover me. I don't qualify for the debate, but I need you to cover me so I qualify for the debate. So really, you have the mitigating factor here. I'm trying to find the email because there are other things. One says that I need to have public events in my district. Well, when I have public events in my district, what determines if they're open to the public? Is it participation? Is it attendance? If I go speak in front of a building and say it's open to the public, does that technically qualify as a public debate, or does it not? Or does it qualify as a public event, or does it not? There's a lot of these judgment call rules. I'll try to find this email because there's a bunch of them that are open to judgment. Again, they wanted a designated office space, but I said, your deadline for this is during independent petitioning. So I needed to have all these things. So independent petitioning happens April 16th to the end of May. So I had to have all these things in place before I even knew if I was on the ballot or not. I didn't find out I was on the ballot till after petition challenge and all the other crap we go through until July. So I'm calling you in August, knowing for 2 weeks I've been on the ballot. I'm trying to get my stuff organized. Like, oh, you didn't qualify because you had to have this in by June. Well, I didn't know if I was even a candidate in June because I didn't get approved on the ballot for weeks after. So, they say it's an ignorance of how petitioning and ballot works and the elections work. I think it's a feature, not a bug. I think they do it on purpose because it allows them to stifle and control who's in the debate, who's there, who's televised, and it gives them easy, very, very easy opt-outs to not include other people. And it's really sad to see. League of Women's Voters did host a debate. They've done a good job. They'll put anyone on the ballot there. Some other organizations did host debates, but it's not the same because the media doesn't come. This was a televised debate by a large media company in the area. And them and I had some words, and I said, you wonder why people don't trust the media. You wonder why you guys get mocked, shunned, and ostracized when you go out in public. Well, this is a great example. You have the opportunity to do the right thing, and you're using loopholes, technicalities, and judgment calls to keep people out. And the guy said, well, you're not going to win. Why does it matter?
Wow.
And I said, well, I guess in my opinion, suppressing a minority because minority isn't really something that historically has worked well and really shouldn't be done. And are my ideas less important because there's less of us? Are my ideas less valid? And their response was, oh, I don't know. And it's just stuff like that. And the problem is the average person doesn't care. That's the thing. When we talked about rigged elections and, elections in general, yes, they are rigged. 100% rigged. I mean, another example, this was in 2020. In 2020 for president, you had 3 candidates on every single ballot in the country: Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate. You wouldn't know Jorgensen was on every ballot because she wasn't allowed to participate in the debates. Well, why wasn't she allowed to participate in the debates? Well, because she didn't poll high enough in certain polls. Well, those polls didn't include her. So it's like asking you, do you like Burger King and McDonald's? You answer, and then I get rid of Taco Bell. You'd say, well, that was never an option. Taco Bell didn't poll high enough in the debate. They weren't in. And it's stuff like that prevents, the outside independent voices from being heard, which is really sad because a lot of third parties and minor parties, their ideas have been eventually absorbed by the larger parties. That is one thing that, the Libertarian Party and other parties, our ideas have been, we're the first to talk things. The voters hear it and say, wow, I like that idea. Why don't we enact that? Well, now the major parties say, well, we might lose voters, we won't lose our jobs program. We should kind of steal this idea. And that's where, our parties have value. Even if we're not winning elections, we're allowing an out for people who are disenfranchised and upset with the two parties. And we have other ideas and voices that need to be heard to, eventually adapt policy or, change policies. So that's kind of the frustrating thing. And as this country gets more and more divided, separated, and down the road we're going, suppressing minority voices and outsider voices becomes more crucial because the two-party system doesn't want to lose its grasp on everything they control. So.
Great. Well, thank you. We're going to talk about more, and I actually do want to talk about the Adams indictment and Cuomo, because I don't think, as much as I may not like a particular politician, I don't want the FBI and the Department of Justice telling me who I'm allowed to vote for. And there's so much corruption. Whenever anyone gets indicted, you always wonder, well, why that guy and not the other really rotten, corrupt guy? Yeah. And I have some theories on that, but I want to go to Robert. And I also I forgot at the beginning, before we get too far and open it up, On tomorrow, that is the 28th of September, is the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C. Jose Vega and I both are speakers there. It is co-sponsored by the Libertarian Party. Angela McArdle is one of the key organizers of it. She's your national chair. Really wonderful person, I have to say, and committed to peace, which is the urgent unifying thing. And I would encourage everybody either to go to the rally in Kingston, New York on Saturday, the 28th, with Scott Ritter, Judge Napolitano. I understand Roger Waters is going to be, I don't know if he's live or online, but he's involved. Max Blumenthal, Anya Parampil, that's Kingston, New York, starting at 2 or 3 p.m. And then the Rage Against the War Machine in DC near the Washington Monument, Saturday at 12 noon. And now I'm going to go to Jose's campaign representative, Robert Castle, who has a report on some other kinds of censorship, which I think also indicate very clearly that it's tied to the military and war policy. So Robert, welcome, and please go ahead.
Hi, is my audio coming through?
Yep.
Great. So if you don't mind, I'd like to do something slightly different to introduce my remarks about what we're actually doing right now with the campaign, which is I was reading something by Edgar Poe, who people may know was a citizen of the Bronx in the 1840s. And the reason why I'm going to this is because obviously this campaign is taking place in the Bronx in the district that's currently run by Richie Torres. And for anyone who's been to or through the South Bronx, you would know at first glance that it is a dystopia, an actual a truly destroyed place, and that the people there certainly exist under monetary and mental tyranny. So anyway, the reason why I want to read this is because it's very relevant to everything that Mr. Whitmer covered, and you as well, Diane, which is this is a battle that Edgar Poe was involved in the newspaper industry and the literary world in the 1830s as a conscious partisan of the Republican faction of John Quincy Adams. And he says, he's describing his literary method. He says, our magazine is going to have an absolutely independent criticism, a criticism self-sustained, guiding itself only by the purest rules of art, analyzing and urging these rules as it applies to them, holding itself aloof from all personal bias, acknowledging no fear save that of outraging what is right, yielding no point either to the vanity of the author or to the assumptions of antique prejudice, or to the involute and anonymous cant of the quarterlies, or to the arrogance of those organized cliques which, hanging like nightmares to American literature, manufacture, at the nod of our principal booksellers, a pseudo-public opinion by wholesale. These are objects of which no man need be ashamed. So I think it's very much worth bearing in mind in any of these conversations that this kind of censorship predates even, the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act. This battle for truth is really coextensive with the constitutional republic. And so in that kind of context is the campaign. And it's very funny because everywhere we go in the Bronx, people know that there is a person named Richie Torres and that he does appear places in public sometimes and says things, but I don't think that anyone really has any notion as to what he does or who he really is. And almost everyone that we speak to, what they really speak about is the unlivable housing conditions, the fact that they can't afford food, the fact that they can't afford to live, the transportation is completely dysfunctional and broken down, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on because that's the situation. And so you know, Duane went through a lot of the kind of arcane rules of how the collusion between the media and the state bureaucracy keeps people out of the simply out of political life. And obviously that's happening with Jose's campaign. There's been virtually a no formal acknowledgement whatsoever of the campaign by Richie Torres, because of course, you know, Richie Torres is very busy touring Israel with Yoav Gallant, who on October 9th said, you know, I am ordering a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no food, no water, no electricity. We're dealing with human animals and we're going to behave accordingly. So Richie Torres is very openly aligned with an ethno-supremacist and genocidal regime, and that's what he represents in his official position as a U.S. representative for the Bronx, to the point where when Benjamin Netanyahu makes a recommendation that there be increased censorship on U.S. campuses, the next day Richie Torres introduces legislation to increase surveillance on campuses, and it just goes like that. So the corruption in that instance is very complete, I would say. And so what we're doing with the campaign is we're just completely subverting the logic. Obviously, you know, when you look at the FEC filing of Richie Torres's campaign and you see the largest financial institutions of the world, like BlackRock and Google and other financial conglomerates, you understand that you're not going to quote unquote beat them by playing by their rules, because their rules are the financial system that has the entire world in its grips at this point. But the funny thing is that once you understand that Richie Torres and many others like him really are fictional characters, you can perceive a very different reality, which is that ideas do actually affect the world directly. And so we've been collaborating with a doctor who was in Gaza in April on a life-saving mission. He's a trauma surgeon who's been on over 40 life-saving missions throughout his decades-long career. He was on grounds. His name is Dr. Mark Perlmutter, and he was on ground zero on 9/11 and in many other notable disaster areas providing medical aid. And what he said, along with his colleague Feroz Sidwa, is that what he saw in Gaza in the first week exceeded everything that he had seen in his entire career before that. So that's about, you know, it's an almost incomprehensible statement, except for the fact that it's just clearly the case that the level of destruction that's being brought down on Gaza is completely unprecedented, and it has been normalized. So we are through our forced complicity in the continuation of this genocide. It's I think people almost don't realize how truly horrifying what is happening over there is continuing to be. And what we did with Dr. Mark Perlmutter's testimony is that we heard from him that even though he had limited success reaching members of the parliament, even in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, he made a very wide appeal internationally, that he could not receive a hearing from a single sitting member of the U.S. Congress, that they just simply refused to speak to him. And he wrote an open letter to the president in July, with relevant State Department officials CC'd, and he received no response. And it is this question of the media is relevant here because Dr. Mark Perlmutter actually had a pretty wide media tour, but he and his colleagues have become completely disillusioned with this idea of exposure because they watched their testimonies get clipped down and sort of transformed into these quote unquote palatable reports. But when we heard that he was getting blocked out of the U.S. Congress, the natural thought was, given that the General Assembly was opening its session, to just take this testimony directly to the United Nations. And the first day that Jose was down there with the campaign, what we saw was that the UN was just immediately censoring the testimony. And it almost doesn't matter whether that's the result of just the kind
Can
of,
you say how? Because many of the speakers at the UN were not. Many of the speakers were talking about this.
of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
so,
good.
so what we were doing was just simply leafleting outside the delegate entrance of the UN, and they were the guards at the delegate entrance were just confiscating the leaflet, but they weren't, they were taking it away from people out of their hands. And then once they caught wind of what they were collecting, they started asking people to take it out of their bags, and they weren't letting people in if they had the leaflet. So it's kind of like no truth allowed is the basic rule there. And what I was going to say is I don't think it really matters whether this is the kind of just knee-jerk bureaucratic censorship or whether it's a targeted operation to keep specific testimonies out, because the net result is the same, which is that reality is being kept out of the conversation. And that was the power of Dr. Mark Perlmutter's testimony. That is the power of his testimony, is that he has been there in this war zone, and he treated dozens of dying children, and he knows, and he has encountered this reality directly. So when they censored the leaflet, the natural response in our mind is to simply increase the effort. So over the past weeks, we've been, over the past week or so since they censored the leaflet, we have issued an open letter to the Secretary General of the UN asking him to redress the violation of the Charter of the UN, because there was a violation of freedom of expression. But also we sent out Perlmutter's testimony to the entire UN press corps and to essentially all the media that we could find. And the effort is obviously that we have to make sure that Perlmutter's testimony can reach the highest levels of the US government and the UN in during this period where we're expecting Netanyahu to speak at the UN either today or tomorrow, and it's quite likely that he is going to simply push for the already kind of it would not be surprising if what he said at the UN was, we need to have a war with Iran or something to that effect. So the fact that you mentioned in the opening that we have, or maybe it was something that was said earlier, but that that the entire population is completely, that we're just going along with these wars and these war plans. And you played the video of Putin. How is it the case that there's not tens of thousands of people flooding out into the street? I think it is because that reality has been slowly and progressively sort of stolen away from people. And I think a big part of that does boil down to the fact that independent candidates are censored out of the public debate, and the entire public discourse is really a farce, at this point. I would just maybe end by noting that there's an article that was run in the New Yorker on the 22nd. It's titled, "Volodymyr Zelensky has a plan for Ukraine's victory." And you you would think that after years of military experts crying out in public that this is a strategically unwinnable war, and that hundreds of thousands of people are dying needlessly, and these really egregious interventions by parties that have nothing to do with the ostensible parties at conflict, that people would begin to catch wind of it. But it does seem to be that the censorship, that there's a mental tyranny that people somehow need to, it seems to me that and it's definitely in evidence in the Bronx, but that it's not just censorship, that things are being kept out of the media, but that people don't seem to know what the truth is when they see it. And that, to me, that's a question as to how we can reawaken people's sense of reality and truth.
I agree. Duane, any response or thoughts on what he just went through?
One thing that the political class likes to do is, one reason why they suppress these outside thoughts and ideas is because they rely on the average American and the average voter to not know what's going on. This is why redress and grassroots organization is so important, because I see this with a guy I work with as a First Amendment auditor, auditing Erie County, and what he does is he's a media station. He covers things, and he finds a lot of issues, even at a local level, a lot of local corruption, a lot of local problems, and he highlights it, and then he'll come to a board meeting. But one thing, that the most powerful thing he has behind him, is when he goes somewhere and gets treated poorly, thousands of people call and hammer these departments to the point where they have to change their phone number, their phones are turned off, their phones are shut down, text, government buildings have to shut down for the day because they're getting so many phone calls. And it sounds funny and it sounds weird, but what it does is it says, oh, well, now the average person knows what's going on. We have to do something about this. He's gotten a sign. He's affected a handful of elections. The biggest thing we have right now is the First Amendment in redress, because the political machines are relying on the average voter to be ignorant and the average American to not understand what's going on. And when you start to inform them and get them calling places, it's harder at a more national level, because they have more levels of bureaucracy and numbers to go through. But at a local level, it's been amazing, because he went into a local town board meeting, and got pushed out by a sheriff. That week, thousands of phone calls came in, ranging from polite to impolite, but it's not his problem. He can't decide what people say. And they changed their policy. They said, oh yeah, we have to change our policy. People got mad. When people get mad and wake up and start to say, this isn't right, this isn't fair, that's when they'll listen. So I think that's one of our biggest benefits, is the First Amendment and the ability to redress, and that grassroots organization where people are calling, and it doesn't take a lot of time, and you just need to make a phone call and tell people you're upset about something. That is a very powerful tool that we need to start using more, because that's what's going to get people's attention, and that's what's going to get some of these politicians to take us seriously. So that's really, as you saw, when you try to educate people what happens, they're going to try to shut it down. Well, we got to find alternative ways to educate them, to force them to take it seriously.
Yeah. Now, I know I brought up the indictment of Adams because I know it's all over the news. It's going to be on people's minds, and it's really easy to say, oh yeah, he's terribly corrupt. Of the people in office, who isn't corrupt? To my mind, this whole witch hunt of taking his computer, his cell phone, all of this began after he decided to make a trip down to the border. The city is totally overwhelmed. It's harming the budget. Duane, I really appreciate what you said about the migrants, because that is absolutely the case. Anyone who thinks that they're getting red carpet treatment, while no, it's just using people for a financial game, and it's incredibly corrupt and ugly and satanic. And the fact that people have not done anything to stop the slaughter of children in Gaza, or the starvation of children, or that now it's been revealed that Tony Blinken actually covered it up, that US agencies said there was starvation occurring, that the Israelis were blocking all food, and Blinken said, oh no, we see no evidence of that. So it's of a piece. But now all of a sudden, and what are they using to go after Adams? The FARA Act, the same thing on Scott Ritter, Foreign Agent Registration Act. And I will say Gillibrand had been the prime co-sponsor of a bill that was so egregious it couldn't pass, called the Restrict Act. Did you see that, Duane? Do you remember that? The Restrict Act?
Vaguely, I don't remember exactly. I've heard of it, and I know it. I'm drawing a blank on it right now.
Yeah, it listed the enemies, right? Iran, China, North Korea, Russia. And then it said if you somehow do anything or use an app that has any connection to those countries, you can serve up to 25 or 20 years in jail, be fined $250,000, and the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply, so you don't get to find out what you did wrong or what you're accused of. It was a 55-page piece of legislation. I read it, and then I just figured it was so it didn't get out of committee. It didn't pass. So I wondered what had happened. Well, I did mention Gillibrand's name in association with it, including in some interventions that got a lot of coverage around the Assange case and different things. So a new act was signed into law by Joe Biden, I think this past July, called Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversaries. And I bet everyone doesn't know that there's all these foreign adversaries out there. Like, you remember Saddam Hussein? If we hadn't destroyed Iraq, he would have been over here the next day. That's what they told us. If we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to be invading, San Francisco Harbor or whatever. I mean, it's just nonsense. So this new act, Gillibrand is not even a sponsor. I think I made it a little hot for her, but I think this is part of what they may be using to go after people, where they say if you have a platform like TikTok that is owned by a foreign country, then somehow this is bad for American people, and it allows all kinds of really unbelievable penalties. Like the company can be fined $500 per user, and that's over 1 million users, that kind of thing. So this is pre-war propaganda. We had this prior to World War I, when they decided that we had to be allies with the British, and people used to know that the British did terrible things to the Americans, like the prison ships and torture and all kinds of horrible things. And that all changed because we had to be allied with the British in World War I. And in fact, there was a film produced called The Spirit of 1776. My campaign coordinator, Suzanne Klebe, gave a whole presentation. How did we shift from suddenly having the British as our greatest ally? Well, the truth of the American Revolution was suppressed. And so what they did, they had a lawsuit, totally appropriate, which they called the USA versus the Spirit of 1776. And then they put the producer of the movie in jail. So that is similar. That is a similar kind of what we see today. I think it has directly to do with the war. My suspicion is with Adams is that it absolutely has to do with the migrants, or perhaps other things that he's found, because there's plenty of corruption to go around. I didn't like Cuomo. I thought they were going to do a case against Cuomo for putting elderly people back in nursing homes with COVID. And then they changed it to Me Too. And then no charges were ever brought, but they forced him out of office when an election was a couple months away. Why don't you put that before the voters? Why don't the voters get to have a say in these things? That's what I really object to.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the fact that they're using the FARA, the foreign agent registry concept to go against Eric Adams is very interesting. I think that the point that whether or not it's the idea that whether or not he is really involved in some kind of corrupt dealing isn't exactly the question at issue. I think that's very relevant in general, because you have the case of Trump, who I think for most people, if they look at things objectively, they'll see that, you know, his just like RFK, his position with regard to Zionist interests is connected to money that he receives. But at the same time, you can't deny the fact that the role that they are playing in electoral politics is extremely important, in the sense that they are the only people who are actually speaking about the reality of a nuclear war threat. And so if you get in this kind of moralistic idea that, you know, that you're going to point fingers at somebody for breaking a rule, well, yeah, of course we should have a society where you could actually have a moral responsibility and legal accountability for crimes, but it seems pretty clear that that is being used on multiple levels to sort of muddy the waters as to what people should really be paying attention to. And in terms of Eric Adams and the humanitarian crisis with the immigrants that are being brought into New York City, I think it would be very interesting to, I did some research recently about the Felix Rohatyn financial takeover of New York City in the mid-70s, where you had essentially a kind of a fascist kind of push in the state legislature of a law that essentially handed over the wallet of the city to a private corporation. And then that was what immediately preceded this, like, you know, these decades of just total of all, you know, the slashing of municipal spending, the slashing of the waste management, and the slashing of the fire departments and the police and everything else, which almost anybody in New York City, if you bring it up with them, they know exactly what you're talking about. Of course, I was talking to a guy and he said, "Oh yeah, those piles of trash in the street, I used to climb on those when I was a kid," because because when this corporation took over the budget of the city, the first thing they did was that they stopped spending money on taking care of the very basic necessities of the human beings that were living in the city. And
Right. Well, that's not that different, because what are they saying? They're saying the people that you voted for are incompetent. Therefore, the bankers who really know how to run things are going to come in and take control, and they're going to tell you how to do it. And so forget having a representative government. You are not allowed to be represented, because we have billionaires, millionaires, and billionaires who know how to do it better than they do, and we're going to run this. So I think we probably should be wrapping up. I hate to say, but that's very important. That's the whole topic we should get into, because this financial control board model was imposed also on Washington, D.C. It's also what they did to Puerto Rico. It's important. It's important. And all of these are an attack on the First Amendment and the principle of the general welfare, because if you can't speak and you can't be represented, then how are you going to hold your representatives accountable to defend the well-being of the state? So, Duane, do you have any closing words here?
No, just, thanks for having me on. Good luck in November. It's a tough task because, like we talked about, they go out of their way to make sure, the two parties like to say, third parties can't win, minor parties can't win, independents can't win, and they go out of their way and bend over backwards. They work harder. They work harder to keep minor voices suppressed than they do to help the people. So it's, good luck. Hope you do well. You got my support, but it's tough being an outsider candidate because they really make it where, you can't compete on a level playing ground, and they go out of their way to make sure that happens. So,
well, thanks very much for being here. And Robert, thank you. And once again, I want to encourage everybody, be heard on Saturday, whether it's Kingston, DC, your town hall, get out there, march down the streets. We're in a lot of danger. Nuclear war is a real threat. There are people in the military who get it, but apparently not elsewhere. Thanks very much.